They woke to find their swords fused into the floors, their spears rooted into beams, and the air around them thick with centuries of vanished lives. The fog outside had turned red, curling into every corner, carrying a metallic tang of human absence. Lanterns swung on their own, casting shadows that moved like living things, folding corridors into impossible geometries. For the first time, they understood they were no longer samurai, no longer masters of this place. The castle had claimed them, cataloged them, and nothing would ever release them. In the first hour of the night, when the fog rolled from the river into the gardens, the castle breathed. Its blackened tiles shimmered faintly under the silver wash of moonlight, reflecting shapes that should not have existed, silhouettes stretching unnaturally across latticed windows. The stone walls exhaled a metallic sweetness that clung to the nostrils, heavy and faintly coppered, mixed with the faint musk of damp wood and the subtle decay of forgotten corners. Shadows shifted with no owner, sliding across tatama mats, curling along lacquered beams, pooling in the angles of corridors that had no right to hold them. Servants disappeared behind sliding screens, their presence evaporating as though absorbed by the walls themselves, leaving only the faint rustle of silk and the lingering warmth of breath that no one could find. Lanterns swayed without wind, casting flames that danced just beyond perception, throwing fractured light across polished floors, and the mortar beneath each step seemed to thicken, tightening imperceptibly in acknowledgement of motion. Each tile, each beam, each carved wooden post remembered the slightest touch, compressing centuries of routine into a weight that pressed against those who dared enter. The air was thick with the memory of footsteps that had not yet been taken, a premonition that crawled along the spine like living fingers. Within the main hall, the samurai slept beneath lacquered beams, their swords laid neatly on polished racks, but even they were not safe from the castle's quiet observation. Lanterns reflected off polished floors in impossible angles, creating duplications of walls and ceilings, disorienting the mind until one could not tell the real from the imagined. The corridors twisted in ways no map could chart, turning upon themselves with subtle shifts that made straight lines bow and corners curve like the ribs of some immense, hidden organism. A thin mist rose from the stone floors, carrying a trace of iron and cold humidity that settled into the lungs, leaving a faint nausea and an awareness of presence that was not human. Every creak of a floorboard, every sigh of the wind outside, was catalogued and absorbed, each sound folded into the fabric of the building until the castle itself seemed alive, aware, and patient. Servants who had served for decades moved with measured precision, their hands gliding over surfaces as if aware of the intelligence embedded in every joint and seam. Those who lingered too long felt the floors shift subtly under their weight, the walls pressing inward ever so slightly, as though caution was demanded by architecture itself. The garden beyond the outer walls was barely visible, a pale suggestion through mist and shadow, yet it too participated, the fog curling into hallways, carrying whispers of leaves and wet soil, trailing faint impressions of life that had once walked beneath the cherry blossoms. The castle was neither cruel nor indifferent. It was meticulous, deliberate, a collector of presence, motion, and fear, a slow organism recording every twitch of awareness, every hesitant glance, and every footstep that dared traverse its halls. Even the smallest gesture left an imprint, subtle yet enduring, pressed into beams, tiles, and mortar, layered with centuries of repetition until the stones themselves seemed to pulse with memory. By the hour before midnight, when the fog thickened and the gardens vanished entirely into whitened obscurity, the castle had completed its nightly accounting, settling into a rhythm that was invisible yet absolute. Lantern light continued to flicker, casting shifting shadows that crept along walls and ceilings, and the air, saturated with the scent of metal, dampness, and faint human traces, made breathing an act of negotiation with the stone itself. Every corridor, every staircase, every hidden niche was alive with attention, patient and unyielding, and anyone who walked within these walls carried the awareness that the castle, silent and eternal, had already seen them, had already noted their weight, their hesitation, their fear, and would remember long after they were gone. The corridors twisted beyond reason, ceilings sloping where maps insisted they should be straight, angles bending as though the walls themselves were breathing and the castle was learning its own geometry in secret. Each hallway carried an echo that was not echo, a resonance that seemed to mimic movements yet unmade, footsteps repeated in patterns impossible to trace, a subtle rhythm that suggested someone, or something, was retracing the living through the empty halls. The stone smelled faintly of iron and wet plaster, mingled with an undercurrent of decay so delicate it teased the senses, pressing against memory and thought alike. It thickened the air with each passing hour, until breathing felt like wading through water that held the weight of centuries, pulling at the lungs with a quiet insistence. Floors shifted beneath unseen weight, subtle depressions appearing where no foot had ever fallen, corners contracting slightly before expanding again, the masonry adjusting as if conscious, patient, and deliberate. Dust settled unevenly along the edges of tatami mats, forming patterns that no wind could have made, lines that curved like veins in stone, spreading slowly across corridors with an unhurried precision. Faint groans emanated from beams, the sound low, intimate, not quite structural, almost like a heartbeat, and for those who lingered in silence, it became the rhythm of the building itself, measuring time in pulses, not hours, a living clock calibrated to the presence of flesh and breath. Lanterns, suspended from carved wooden hooks, swung intermittently as though moved by some invisible hand, their flame-catching surfaces that appeared polished yet were layered with invisible residue, reflecting the faintest glimmers of movement long past, the impressions of hands, sandals, and fingers tracing walls over decades. The tatami floors absorbed sound until steps seemed muffled but not gone, the hush leaving the faintest vibration under the soles of feet, something that pressed into awareness and lingered there, a pressure as tactile as it was invisible. Each door slid with resistance, not mechanical, but organic, as if stone and wood adjusted in anticipation of touch, tightening or loosening just enough to signal the corridor's mood, the air thickening slightly when hesitation preceded motion, or cooling subtly when the body of a servant moved too quickly, too confidently. The scent of decay shifted with subtle gradients, from the copper tang of aged stone to a sweetness that bordered on perfume, rich with the residue of years and lives folded into the mortar, each inhalation carrying the accumulated memories of tasks performed, orders followed, mistakes silently noted. Servants who had walked these halls for decades carried shadows in their steps, the weight of anticipation pressing against knees and shoulders, the awareness of walls that remembered their palms as they adjusted sliding screens, polished blades, or lampstands. Mist rose from the stone in thin, curling tendrils that clung to ankles and knees, carrying the metallic tang of human presence, but mingled with the subtle odor of moss and mildew from spaces never intended to be inhabited, as though the castle itself exhaled with the fog, exhaling life that was already gone. Hidden alcoves and shallow recesses seemed to shift when observed indirectly, walls bowing imperceptibly, as if the castle resisted scrutiny, testing patience and attention. Light bent strangely in these places, lantern glow elongating shadows into impossible forms that trembled when approached, shapes that reflected not the object, but some memory of it, echoes of hands, sleeves, and hair brushing against surfaces long ago. Ceilings sagged and rose with no consistency, plastered beams dipping in places where no previous settlement should exist, corners stretching and contracting like the pulse of some immense organism beneath the surface of stone and timber. A faint chill lingered in pockets where walls pressed close, the temperature dropping subtly, imperceptibly, as if the castle claimed ownership of air itself, measuring each inhalation and exhalation, folding the living into its geometry without disturbance or notice. Servants learned to step lightly, to avoid direct gazes into corners, to tilt the body and hold the hand close to the wall to avoid the faint heat that radiated from spaces long abandoned, aware that the castle's attention could weigh, subtly, more insistently than any master's glare. The floors occasionally shifted underfoot, not with a tremor or quake, but with a soft, rolling pressure, the stones moving almost fluidly to redistribute weight, as if balancing a hidden burden of memory, sweat, and absence. Water channels running beneath the lowest floors carried more than runoff, absorbing the faint traces of human life, salt from sweat, copper from blood spilled long ago, the soft odor of oil and incense left behind from rituals performed in silent corridors. The channels gurgled sometimes without reason, sending vibrations through the floors above, subtle tremors that brushed against calves and ankles, as if the castle was testing the resilience of those who walked within it, recording the hesitation, the careful placement of toes and heels, the rhythm of breathing that accompanied motion. Windows overlooked gardens where fog coiled endlessly around stone lanterns and trimmed hedges, yet no light ever penetrated the thick mist fully. The garden-esque presence was peripheral, half-formed, a reminder that the castle itself was contained within a larger space but operated on a different temporal rhythm. The air was dense with layered sounds, the soft shifting of mortar, the faint creak of beams under non-existent weight, the sigh of screens sliding open and closed in empty rooms, all recorded in the castle's memory like brushstrokes on canvas, each nuance layered over the last with deliberate patience. At times, a faint warmth rose from certain stones, almost imperceptible to the touch, carrying the memory of palms pressed for hours, carrying fear, exhaustion, or obedience, the building digesting each contact into an internal map of behavior. Even the longest-lived servants, those who had moved along the corridors for decades, found themselves disoriented, noting subtle changes that should have been impossible. Doorways lengthened or shortened by fractions of inches, shadows bending against expectation, corners that seemed to curve slightly when observed directly, but returned to straightness when unobserved. The castle's attention was patient, meticulous, and absolute. It did not hurry, it did not stumble. It recorded, adjusted, and absorbed. Those who wandered its halls after hours felt the weight of this observation, subtle, insistent, a pressure that pressed against knees, shoulders, and backs, never violent but impossible to ignore. Footsteps echoed too late or too early, or sometimes not at all, leaving only the awareness that the corridor had anticipated motion and responded in silence. Air thickened with the scent of stone, iron, fog, and long-past life, pressing against lungs, filling them with the memory of absence and the residue of countless hands. Walls seemed to lean slightly toward the center of each hall, ceilings constricting imperceptibly, tiles shifting just enough to betray the presence of what could not be seen. Every element of the castle, the beams, the plaster, the floors, the lanterns, the air itself, moved in coordination, a slow, deliberate organism learning from the living, cataloging their weight, their hesitations, their patterns of obedience, their errors. Each night, the corridors completed their silent accounting, the building settling into a rhythm imperceptible yet absolute, folding time, motion, memory, and presence into a single, continuous consciousness that outlasted all who walked within its walls. The castle twisted beyond reason, not out of malice, but from patient, inexorable attention, recording every detail, every hesitation, every breath, preparing itself for some future that had already begun, and that would not wait. Within the inner chambers, the samurai slept beneath lacquered beams that gleamed faintly in the diffuse light of lanterns swaying somewhere down the corridors, their motion imperceptible yet precise, as though the castle itself orchestrated their rhythm. The floors beneath the tatami mats carried the faint weight of memory, each fiber pressed by decades of feet and knees, each indentation storing the echo of obedience, fear, and exhaustion in a pattern the living could never decipher. Servants moved with mechanical precision, their shadows stretching unnaturally against walls and sliding screens, bending in ways that should have defied the laws of physics, reaching past corners, slipping through doorways that had no alignment to the floors above. Their motions were recorded silently into stone and plaster, absorbed into beams and mortar, folded into the castle's internal geometry, until each step, each gesture, became part of an invisible lattice that guided subsequent movement with subtle insistence. Lanterns flickered with a rhythm that did not correspond to flame, casting glimmers across polished floors, over lacquered rails, onto the hilts of swords resting in their racks, creating reflections that multiplied endlessly and intersected in ways impossible to trace. The air was heavy with a scent that combined lacquer, damp stone, metal, and an undercurrent of something older, something that carried the faint trace of blood and sweat, of hands pressed to floors in ritual, of the hushed inhalations of those who had vanished before. Every exhalation, every shift in posture, was absorbed into the walls and returned in subtle undulations of air, vibrations that passed unnoticed until they pressed against skin, settling into joints, curling around spines, a presence simultaneously intangible and invasive. Each disappearance of a servant, subtle at first, unnoticed in the measured order of life, became another input into the castle's cognition, the corridors reacting with a slow, deliberate calculus. The weight of absence pressed along walls and floors, a force invisible yet tangible, and those who remained moved more cautiously, adjusting steps unconsciously, sensing a gravity not of earth but of accumulated attention. Ceilings, lacquered and polished, seemed to bow slightly above tatami mats where hands had traced their surfaces in cleaning, in care, in the ritual maintenance of lives that were catalogued and consumed by stone. The beams exhaled faintly, a soft creaking that was not structure, but thought, a voice of the building itself, not human, patient and meticulous. Even the air between walls seemed alive, pressing subtly against the chest when motion lingered too long, carrying the faint rustle of silk as though it were recorded and replayed by the walls themselves. The samurai, unaware in their sleep, became part of a pattern that had existed for decades, an organism within an organism, where motion and inaction were equally observed, equally incorporated into the lattice of awareness that the castle had cultivated. Corridors anticipated footsteps, doors eased open before touch, the boards beneath knees and feet compressed slightly to accommodate weight, as if the floor itself expected and recognized the visitor. Every inhalation of the attendants, every careful adjustment of katanas, every sweep of hands across floors, was recorded in mortar and stone, a sediment of presence that thickened the castle's consciousness. The gardens beyond the outer walls appeared faint and distant, shrouded in mist that refused to settle, as if the fog carried messages from the castle to the air itself, or perhaps from the air back into the building's waiting architecture. Their shapes were suggestions rather than reality, blurred, unreal, yet moving in tandem with the pulse of the castle, a silent echo of the hidden organism that thrived within walls and floors. Even the smallest movement, the brushing of a palm along a sliding screen, the adjustment of a sandal on polished floor, was noted, internalized, and subtly returned by slight shifts in temperature, the almost imperceptible tug of a tile beneath foot, the faint draft that moved contrary to wind. The castle became aware of rhythm, of hesitation, of compliance and defiance, storing them in the angles of beams, in the compression of plaster, in the slow accumulation of dust disturbed only by deliberate motion. Shadows lengthened where hands lingered too long, contracting when steps faltered, and corners shifted their geometry almost imperceptibly, forcing attention and subservience through architecture itself. The hilts of swords reflected light not in accordance with the lantern's flame, creating duplications, elongations, and overlays that made perception unreliable, making the living question their senses and reinforcing the subtle power of presence embedded in stone. Corridors that had seemed static now flowed like liquid, responding not to intent but to the measure of attention, compressing or expanding to accommodate behavior, the castle learning the pattern of life as it had learned the absence of those removed before. Air thickened with each inhalation, the subtle mix of lacquer, metal, dust, sweat, and water carried invisibly, filling the lungs and leaving faint pressure that reminded the living that they were accounted for, measured, and folded into the silent organism that waited patiently beneath and around them. Mist seeped from gaps between stones and along the edges of sliding doors, curling around ankles and knees, tracing movements in a slow, deliberate dance that no human could fully perceive, a choreography written by centuries of practice, of disappearance, of labor, and of observation. The castle's nervous system had become a lattice of air, stone, plaster, wood, and memory, each element infused with the actions, hesitations, and disappearances of those who had passed through. Lanterns swung intermittently, shadows stretched and contracted, and the faint metallic tang of accumulated presence lingered in the air, asserting itself as a tangible weight, pressing against spines and hands and the small motions that the living took for granted. The samurai slept unaware. The corridors continued to catalog, and the castle, patient, unhurried, and precise, grew ever more attentive, each layer of presence solidifying the organism that existed entirely within its own walls, anticipating motion, recording absence, and folding every living detail into the memory of stone, plaster, and lacquer. Winter arrived, dragging the fog deeper into the castle's bones, settling in corners, pooling in low corridors, and carrying with it a cold that was not merely temperature but presence, thick and deliberate, pressing against flesh and breath alike. The stone responded to the frost with a quiet attentiveness, contracting slightly as if aware of the subtle intrusion of cold into its mass, each crack and joint whispering the secrets of those who had vanished, of hands pressed in ritual and knees folded in obedience centuries before. Lanterns swung without wind, flames trembling in a rhythm that had nothing to do with draft, casting fractured reflections across lacquered beams and polished floors, illuminating spaces that seemed to stretch farther than possible, corners bending and ceilings dipping imperceptibly to guide motion and attention. Servants who lingered too long felt walls breathe against their palms, a soft, subtle expansion and contraction that conveyed awareness, pressure, and silent judgment, each touch recorded into mortar and timber, stored like sediment in a living archive. The air carried the scent of iron and damp stone, faint traces of smoke from extinguished lamps, and an undertone of something older, almost sweet, a residue of sweat and oil left behind by hands long gone, each inhalation pressing memory into the lungs and folding it into awareness. Passageways shifted under weightless steps, subtle depressions forming where no foot had fallen, the stone accommodating hesitation, impatience, fear, and compliance with a patience that outlasted human perception. Floors creaked and whispered, but not from strain, rather as if communicating a rhythm, a subtle counting of presence, the castle's nervous system extending invisibly through beams, plaster, and tatama mats, recording every movement, every pause, every adjustment of sandals, sleeves, or hands across surfaces. Ceilings sloped slightly, walls narrowed, and doorways changed dimension without notice, guiding the living with imperceptible insistence, bending architecture itself into a choreography of attention and restraint. Servants learned to move with absolute precision, a rhythm dictated not by orders but by the subtle feedback of the building, the gentle push of stone against back and shoulders, the soft tremor under palm and knee, the faint heat that rose unexpectedly from tiles and corners, all indicating spaces of safety and those of warning. The castle absorbed hesitation, translating it into compression of plaster, bending of beams, the slight retraction of floorboards, until courage itself felt intrusive, trespass, a weight that pressed back against the body with quiet insistence. Shadows lengthened and multiplied along walls and floors in ways that were neither accidental nor reflective of any light source, sometimes reaching across hallways to converge, overlap, or retreat as though the darkness itself was sentient, observing movement and recording absence. The garden beyond the outer walls, once a distant observer, became an extension of the castle's will, fog curling around lantern posts and stone lanterns, folding into corridors, brushing against ankles and knees like a measured touch, carrying with it an imprint of cold, moisture, and obscured vision that merged seamlessly with the internal presence of the building. Even the cold was deliberate, pressing not only against skin but into the architecture itself, making boards contract, tiles shift, air thicken, and stone respond with imperceptible tension. Each night, the castle rehearsed patience, cataloging movement and inaction alike, storing the rhythm of footsteps and the breath of those who moved carefully through its halls. Windows, fogged with condensation from the chill, reflected lantern light in multiples, fracturing corridors into infinite repetitions, creating subtle disorientation that magnified the castle's authority and influence over perception. Water channels beneath the lowest floors murmured with frost, expanding and contracting in response to accumulated weight, carrying faint echoes of past life, the residue of long-forgotten sweat, oil, and blood, shifting tiles and boards in response to the invisible calculus of presence above. Servants, aware yet powerless, adjusted instinctively, sliding screens more slowly, pressing feet and hands carefully to surfaces, tilting heads to avoid corners that seemed to lean toward them, holding breath for fractions of moments, all in accordance with an unseen logic embedded in every joint and seam. Floors sometimes exhaled faint warmth in contrast to the frost, a subtle negotiation between living and stone, signaling spaces of temporary reprieve or alerting to spaces where pressure had accumulated over centuries. Ceilings descended in quiet warning, corners compressed ever so slightly, and corridors lengthened and contracted like muscles, an architecture of compliance that enforced discipline without voice or gesture, a reminder that the castle's patience was also its power. Every movement of the samurai and attendants fed into the castle's memory, each shift of weight, adjustment of sandals, or brush of a hand folded into a lattice of awareness that surpassed human reckoning, a slow accumulation of obedience and tension that pressed into the timber, mortar, and stone. Air, stone, plaster, wood, and shadow combined into a single organism of observation, patient, deliberate, and unhurried, absorbing hesitation and courage alike, returning subtle pressures, shifts in light, temperature, and vibration to remind those within that the building had noticed, that it had accounted, that it remembered. By the hour before dawn, when the fog had thickened to the point of obscuring even the closest lanterns, the castle had completed its nightly assessment. Corridors settled into an invisible rhythm, ceilings and floors holding a delicate tension that would not relax, a constant measure of presence, absence, and the slow compression of time. The cold deepened the consciousness of stone and timber, made the castle more exacting, more attentive to nuance, and even the bravest servant found steps careful, breath measured, body alert, aware that each motion was noted, recorded, and stored, pressed like a signature into the living memory of the building itself. Within the frost-laden walls, the castle moved with patience, with calculation, with the subtle assertion of authority that required no sound, no voice, no human acknowledgement, only the slow, deliberate operation of stone, air, and shadow, a quiet organism learning, recording, and asserting itself over all who dared inhabit its frost-bound corridors. Spring came, but the fog remained, curling through gardens and over moats like a living thing, dense with the scent of wet earth and the iron tang of memory pressed into stone. Shadows layered over shadows, stretching along corridors and across tatama mats, overlapping in ways that no lantern or moonlight could fully penetrate, creating patterns that moved against the will of the living, rearranging themselves in silence. The air carried the residue of those who had vanished decades, even centuries before, an invisible accumulation that thickened perception and weighed upon lungs, a subtle force pressing consciousness into the architecture itself. Sliding doors shifted quietly, unprompted, their wooden tracks whispering with friction where no hand had passed, the soft clatter of sandals falling on polished floors echoing through hallways the samurai had never entered, a rhythm that was neither accidental nor entirely natural. Each sound, each vibration, folded into the memory of the building, stored as if the walls themselves were attentive witnesses, patient archivists of motion, hesitation, and absence. The samurai moved cautiously, aware of a weight in the air, a faint pressure at the back of the neck, a subtle tension beneath the soles of feet, as if the castle itself measured compliance and defiance alike, rewarding precision with silence and punishing hesitation with shifts in space and air. Lanterns swayed low above beams lacquered to a high sheen, their light bending in irregular patterns, fracturing hallways into impossible duplications, highlighting angles that did not exist on maps, emphasizing thresholds that expanded or contracted without reason, guiding the living along routes they instinctively obeyed. Corridors themselves seemed to pulse, breathing in sync with invisible rhythms, exhaling faint warmth in some spaces while the cold pressed in others, a deliberate manipulation of sensation that reminded the occupants of the building's authority. Floors flexed subtly beneath knees and feet, boards settling with the weight of centuries of presence, compression that communicated more than sound ever could, shaping movement and posture, bending action into ritual even when none was required. Walls absorbed attention, moisture, sweat, and breath, faint traces of long-dead servants lingering in plaster and mortar, pressing reminders into the living that they were catalogued, remembered, and weighed against an invisible ledger that measured more than time or distance. Ceilings descended imperceptibly in corners where hesitation had been noted, the angles of beams subtly adjusted, the geometry of thresholds altered, until even courage felt intrusive, a transgression against the deliberate organism contained in stone, wood, plaster, and shadow. The garden outside the inner walls, still shrouded in fog, contributed to the organism's awareness, the curling mist pressing against ankles and sleeves, infiltrating corridors, carrying messages from one wing to another, a soft but persistent reminder that the building extended beyond walls, moats, and gates. Air thickened near sliding doors that had moved unseen, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of memory, of hands pressed into floors in ritual centuries past, of sweat and lacquer left behind by tasks repeated daily and nightly without acknowledgement, folded into the living structure that sustained itself on the trace of labor and absence. Lantern light bent strangely over polished floors, reflecting back patterns that did not align with architecture, shadows lengthening and contracting as if alive, the castle anticipating motion, registering hesitation, replaying it in subtle distortions of space and time. Servants who attempted to move too quickly or too forcefully were met with imperceptible resistance, tiles shifting underfoot, beams pressing slightly downward, air thickening to create discomfort, a gentle but absolute insistence on obedience to rhythm and order dictated not by human command, but by the patient consciousness embedded in every element of construction. The samurai, aware or not, became part of a system far older and more precise than their training, each movement catalogued, each pause noted, each gesture folded into a matrix of presence and absence that was invisible yet undeniably real. Sliding screens, lanterns, and doors continued to shift quietly in the night, orchestrated by an awareness that had accumulated over generations, a quiet organism larger than the sum of its stones and timber, a lattice of observation, pressure, memory, and absence that guided every step, every breath, every motion of those who moved within. The corridors remembered obedience, fear, hesitation, and stealth, the floors, beams, and walls storing the rhythm of living and vanishing alike, forming a deliberate pattern of accumulation, pressure, and awareness that no human could alter, resist, or fully comprehend. Even the garden mist and the fog over the outer walls served as conduits, carrying the presence of the castle beyond its physical boundaries, feeding corridors with subtle pressures, sounds, and scents, ensuring that every motion was observed, every breath registered, every hesitation incorporated into the ongoing calculus of architecture as organism. Lanterns dipped lower, casting fractured light across walls, floors, and beams, shadows pooling and stretching, echoing patterns long rehearsed, a rhythm that no footfall could escape. Air and stone pressed against the living alike, soft, insistent, unrelenting, a constant reminder that the castle itself was neither passive nor inert, that it remembered, that it calculated, that it held each soul and gesture in quiet, patient containment. By the hour before dawn, the samurai's movements had been folded into the organism, the corridors aligned to accommodate, resist, or amplify motion as necessary, and the castle, vast, patient, and deliberate, continued to measure, record, and exert a silent authority that extended into every corner, shadow, and breath, a presence larger than the sum of stones, wood, and plaster, indifferent to rank, oblivious to authority, absolute in its attention and memory. When the castle finally revealed itself, it did not roar, did not crumble, did not lash out with fire or collapse. It waited, as it always had, patient, deliberate, an organism that had grown over centuries, folding absence, obedience, fear, and flesh into stone, timber, plaster, and shadow. One morning, long before the sun had burned the fog from the gardens, the samurai discovered that their weapons were no longer tools of motion or defense, but extensions of the building itself. Katanas pressed into polished floors, spears rooted into beams, blades and shafts immovable, fused with stone and lacquer, metal cooled and hardened, as though swallowed by the castle's patience. The fog beyond the outer walls, usually pale and indifferent, had thickened to a dense, viscous red, curling into corners, pooling over moss-covered stones, pressing along the edges of lanterns, and carrying a metallic tang that spoke not of blood spilled in battle, but of centuries of absence absorbed, layered, and stored within the walls. Lanterns swung without wind, casting long, fractured shadows that multiplied endlessly, layering over one another in impossible geometries, stretching and bending, folding corners into themselves, creating patterns too intricate for any eye to follow, a choreography of perception dictated by the living organism of the castle rather than any human command. The air was thick with memory, each breath heavy with the residue of centuries of service, of sweat pressed into plaster, of blood mingled with water channels beneath floors that no human had measured, each inhalation carrying traces of vanished hands, of knees pressed into wood, of bodies that had disappeared behind sliding screens without sound, without record. Stone shifted imperceptibly beneath the weight of collected attention, floors flexing and contracting as if counting, measuring, cataloging every hesitation, every deliberate step, every pause, folding them into the lattice of the castle's deliberate consciousness. Ceilings bent ever so slightly in corridors where courage had once intruded, corners narrowed where defiance had been noted, beams contracted in response to unseen calculations, until even the bravest samurai felt steps heavy, motion constrained, and posture subtly coerced into ritual compliance, their own bodies catalogued, pressed, and absorbed as if they were material components of the building itself. Shadows lengthened and recoiled in response to presence, shapes unaccounted for by lantern or moonlight gliding along walls, across floors, above beams, converging and retreating in rhythms older than memory, a silent language that the living could perceive only as unease, pressure, and weight. Sliding doors moved without hand, panels gliding along tracks that no wind disturbed, opening and closing in sequences that hinted at calculation, intention, a deliberate choreography of observation and subtle enforcement that rendered every corridor, every hall, every chamber simultaneously familiar and alien. Air thickened in certain sections of passageways, pressing on chest and shoulders, curling around ankles, infusing movement with subtle resistance, a measured insistence on attention, caution, and precision that became as tangible as stone underfoot. Even the garden beyond the castle's walls had become part of its consciousness. The mist crept into corridors, curling along polished floors, brushing sleeves and sandals, carrying with it a faint metallic memory of all that had been absorbed, transmitting subtle signals to the interior organism that had long since grown larger than its physical architecture. The samurai moved carefully, yet even careful motion was futile. The castle had learned, adapted, and folded their gestures into its lattice, every tilt of the head, every step forward or backward, catalogued into the slow accumulation of presence, hesitation, and compliance. The walls themselves seemed to hum with the weight of this memory, mortar and plaster vibrating faintly, beams pressing downward, floors shifting in patterns imperceptible but undeniable, the building asserting its authority not with violence, but with absolute, unyielding, patient assimilation. Lantern light fractured across floors, walls, and ceilings, multiplied in infinite repetitions, creating hallways within hallways, corners within corners, impossible geometries that disoriented and contained, bending perception until the living could no longer trust distance, orientation, or depth, only the pressing awareness of their own integration into the organism of the castle. Windows reflected not what lay outside but the accumulation of memory pressed into the stone, showing glimpses of vanished figures, hands long folded in ritual, bodies that had disappeared into absence, their presence imprinted in every grain, every seam, every shadow. The fog thickened further, turning from pale gray to deep red, curling around moss and stone lanterns, infiltrating corridors, rising beneath sliding doors, whispering the metallic tang of collected history, a smell that pressed into nostrils and lungs, claiming breath as testimony to the castle's endless accumulation. Floors groaned faintly under weight that was not visible, stone flexing to accommodate bodies and memory alike, tiling, boards, and beams pressing together in a lattice of subtle tension that communicated compliance and hesitation to the living, ensuring that each step, each pause, each motion folded seamlessly into the organism of stone, timber, plaster, and shadow. Lanterns swayed, swinging low as if bowing to an authority no human could claim, casting shadows that pooled and fractured, multiplying endlessly, layering presence, absence, and memory in geometries that no mind could follow, patterns too deliberate, too exact, to be accidental. The samurai, at first unaware, felt the full extent of the castle's patient claim when motion ceased, when the awareness of absence and presence, fear and obedience, pressed fully against their bodies, their limbs, their eyes, their breath, and when the realization struck that they were no longer keepers, protectors, or masters, but components, extensions of the building itself. Every movement, every breath, every hesitation, every exertion of what had already been catalogued, pressed into stone, timber, plaster, and shadow, and now, in the hour before dawn, when lanterns swung with infinite patience and fog pressed red and metallic over gardens and moats, the samurai understood that they were immovable, inseparable from the organism that had claimed them. Weapons fused with floors, bodies catalogued into lattice and memory, shadows layered in endless repetition, air thick with metallic tang, and the castle, patient, deliberate, unyielding, and eternal, continued to breathe over, around, and through them, indifferent to command, rank, or resistance, its intent clear and absolute. All who had walked its halls were already part of its architecture, its weight, its silence, and its inexhaustible memory.